November 8, 1942, Gestapo headquarters, Lyon. Sturmbannführer Klaus Barbie stood before a detailed street map of the city, red pins marking each suspected resistance safe house, each failed raid, each agent who had simply vanished. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and frustration. His men had been chasing ghosts for 15 months. Barbie slammed his fist on the table, scattering reconnaissance photographs across the polished wood. These were the best counterintelligence operatives in occupied Europe, trained at the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin, equipped with direction-finding equipment capable of triangulating radio transmissions within minutes, supported by the full apparatus of informants, collaborators, and Vichy police. And yet they could not catch one American woman. This limping spy, Hauptsturmführer Ernst Dunkel said, lighting another cigarette, his voice thick with contempt. She's crippled, for God's sake. How hard can it be to find a woman who drags a wooden leg through Lyon? The other officers laughed. Someone made a joke about checking all the hospitals for spare parts. Another suggested posting men outside orthopedic shops. The mood in the room shifted from frustration to ridicule. She's an amateur, Dunkel continued. An American journalist playing at espionage. The SOE is so desperate they're sending disabled women into the field. Give it 2 more weeks. She'll make a mistake. They always do. Barbie nodded slowly, allowing himself a tight smile. The Abwehr had already dismissed this Virginia Hall as insignificant. Female operatives rarely lasted more than 3 months. The wooden leg made her conspicuous, easy to identify. It was only a matter of time. What Barbie didn't know was that at that precise moment, Virginia Hall was 3 blocks away, sitting in the back room of Germaine Guérin's brothel on Rue Sainte-Hélène, coordinating the largest prison break in SOE history. She had already recruited 90 agents across southern France, individuals Barbie's entire network of informants had failed to identify. She was transmitting German troop movements to London through channels the Gestapo didn't even know existed. And the wooden leg that was supposed to make her easy to catch had become her greatest camouflage, transforming a 36-year-old American woman into an unassuming middle-aged French peasant that German soldiers looked past a dozen times a day. Within 48 hours, 12 SOE agents would walk out of Mozac prison, using a key made from tools smuggled in sardine tins, while Barbie's men watched train stations for a limping woman who was already organizing what would eventually become 1,500 French resistance fighters under her direct command. The Gestapo had been hunting the wrong woman entirely. German counterintelligence doctrine had been refined through a decade of operations against communist networks in the Weimar Republic, perfected during the annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia, and brutally proven during the conquest of Poland and France. Every requirement was born from specific operational failures. The 1938 Amsterdam debacle, where Dutch resistance had turned 2 Abwehr officers, established the principle that no agent should operate without regular check-ins using established codes. The Prague network collapse of 1940, where 37 resistance members were arrested in a single night, proved that safe houses must change weekly and never be used more than 3 times. The catastrophic loss of the Belgian Comet Line in 1941, where 156 Allied pilots were recaptured after being freed, demonstrated that escape networks required professional handlers with military training, established credentials, and verifiable backgrounds. Each protocol addressed documented casualties. Cover stories had to withstand professional interrogation. Agents needed multiple identity documents from different sources. Radio operators required secure locations with escape routes. Women operatives, when permitted at all, worked in support roles: couriers, safe house managers, secretaries. The Sicherheitsdienst calculated that female agents cracked under interrogation at twice the rate of men. Physical disability was an automatic disqualifier. The consensus among German intelligence professionals was clear. Field operations demanded physical fitness, military discipline, and ruthless compartmentalization. The system worked. By November 1942, German counterintelligence had rolled up 43 resistance networks across France, arrested over 2,000 operatives, and maintained a 92% success rate in turning captured agents. While German intelligence officers documented their successes, Virginia Hall was systematically violating every principle they'd established. On October 12, 1941, she walked into a meeting in Marseille that her instincts told her was compromised. She didn't go. 12 SOE agents attended. All 12 were arrested. She became the only operative in southern France with a functioning radio. Rather than retreat, she expanded operations. She used the same safe houses for months because she recruited people the Germans never imagined could be assets. The brothel owner, Germain Guérin, whose employees extracted intelligence from German officers between sheets. Dr. Jean Rousset, whose gynecology practice gave him access to Vichy officials' wives. Robert Boiteux, a Jesuit priest who hid radio equipment in confessionals. Her cover story as a New York Post correspondent would collapse under any serious interrogation, but she never let anyone get close enough to question it. When SOE headquarters assigned Georges Duboudin to supervise her operations, she judged him a security risk within one meeting and told London to lay off. This was mission number 47 in what would eventually become a network supporting operations that commanded 1,500 resistance fighters. The Gestapo's intelligence assessment from that month described her activities as amateurish and unsustainable. The British response to German counterintelligence doctrine seemed designed to fail. Where the Abwehr required agents to have military backgrounds and professional training, the SOE recruited amateurs, journalists, housewives, clerks, anyone who spoke French and showed basic courage. Where German doctrine demanded agents be physically fit and able to parachute into operation zones, Virginia Hall arrived by train through Spain with a prosthetic leg that made parachute drops impossible. Where the Sicherheitsdienst mandated that agents change locations constantly, Hall operated from Lyon for 15 consecutive months, returning to the same apartment, the same cafes, the same contacts. The SOE gave her almost no training, just 6 weeks of basic security protocols and radio operation. No weapons training, no interrogation resistance, no tradecraft. They sent her to Vichy France with forged paper in her real name, a cover story that could be checked in 5 minutes, and a prosthetic leg that German wanted posters would eventually describe in detail. The contrast was absurd. German intelligence officers had years of professional training at Abwehr schools. Virginia Hall had worked as a consular clerk. German operatives had secure communication channels, established networks, backup protocols. Hall had Western Union telegrams sent to a cutout at the New York Post. The average lifespan of an SOE agent in France was 4 months. 25% were killed. 13 of the 39 women sent to France never came back. Hall lasted 15 months in her first deployment and walked back in for a second tour. What German intelligence professionals saw as fatal incompetence, Virginia Hall exploited as tactical advantage. The wooden leg that made her easy to identify allowed her to pose as a limping old peasant woman that German soldiers instinctively dismissed. She shuffled through checkpoints in a frayed dress and headscarf, her distinctive limp transformed into the generic hobble of rural poverty. Gestapo officers hunting for an athletic American journalist looked straight through a French grandmother struggling with firewood. When she returned for her second mission with the OSS in March 1944, she filed down her teeth to look like a peasant, grayed her hair, and walked with the painful shuffle of arthritis. The disguise was so effective that she operated in the same region where Klaus Barbie had personally distributed wanted posters with her description. On June 14, 1944, a German patrol stopped her at a checkpoint outside Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. She was carrying a suitcase containing a complete radio transmission set, encryption codes, and intelligence reports on Wehrmacht positions. The young Schutzstaffel officer looked at her papers, forged identity as Marcel Montagne, an elderly farm woman, looked at her face, looked at the wooden leg, and waved her through. "Go home, grandmother," he said in broken French. "The roads aren't safe for old women." She transmitted coordinates for Allied bombing raids from a barn 3 kilometers away that same night. This was Operation 247 since her return to France, part of the network that would eventually coordinate 1,500 Maquis fighters in the liberation of Haute-Loire. The German who let her pass wrote in his report that he'd encountered only local civilians, no suspicious activity. An official Sicherheitsdienst assessment, dated September 1942, classification Geheime Reichssache, concluded the following. Analysis of SOE operations in Vichy territory reveals critical structural weaknesses exploitable for network penetration. Female operative designated Marie, American national, represents particularly vulnerable asset. Subject operates with minimal tradecraft, maintains static location in Lyon metropolitan area, relies on civilian contacts with no intelligence training, and possesses physical disability preventing rapid movement or escape. Assessment of subject's heckler network indicates amateur organization susceptible to standard infiltration protocols. Physical description, distinctive. 36 years old, auburn hair, American accent, prosthetic left leg below knee, walks with pronounced limp. Such obvious identifying characteristics render extended field operations impossible. Current intelligence suggests subject has established approximately 70 to 90 local contacts, primarily in Lyon and Toulouse regions. However, network depth is assessed as shallow, lacking professional structure or security compartmentalization. Projected operational lifespan, 6 to 8 weeks maximum before capture or compromise. Recommendation, maintain surveillance, allow network to expand, then execute comprehensive arrest operation to capture entire circuit. Subject's disability and amateur status make her unsuitable for genuine intelligence operations. Current activities likely represent desperate British attempt to maintain presence in advance of inevitable collapse. Resources allocated to this target should remain minimal. Higher priority should be assigned to professional Soviet intelligence networks operating in northern industrial zones. The document carried approval signatures from 3 different Sicherheitsdienst department heads and a concurrent stamp from Abwehr Liaison in Paris. It was comprehensively wrong. While Berlin's finest counterintelligence analysts dismissed her as a temporary nuisance, Virginia Hall was systematically destroying German logistics infrastructure across central France. On the date that assessment was written, she coordinated the escape of 12 imprisoned SOE agents from Mausac prison. An Operation Gestapo headquarters didn't even know it occurred until 3 weeks later when they discovered the empty cells. The 70 to 90 contacts German intelligence had identified were decoys. Her actual network was 3 times that size and included Vichy police officers, German army secretaries, railway workers, and a Luftwaffe supply clerk who photographed fuel depot inventories. The amateur organization had already facilitated the escape of 47 Allied airmen back to England through Spain, and each returning pilot carried intelligence on German coastal defenses that fed directly into Allied invasion planning. Her radio transmissions, which the assessment predicted would be easy to triangulate and shut down, moved locations every 48 hours using equipment hidden in attics, basements, barns, and church sacristies that Gestapo direction-finding teams never located. By the time Virginia Hall reached operation number 632 of her eventual 1,500 resistance operations, German intelligence had captured exactly 0 members of her core network. The officers who signed that assessment were documenting their certainty while she was establishing the foundation for D-Day. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error. Their logic appeared flawless. A woman with a prosthetic leg could not possibly evade professional manhunts. The wooden leg was distinctive, limiting, obvious. It should have made Virginia Hall the easiest target in France. What they failed to understand was that in 1940s occupied France, disability was invisible. German soldiers expected spies to be young, fit, dangerous. They watched for athletic men, suspicious foreigners, nervous travelers. They had been trained to spot the physiological signs of deception: elevated heart rate, excessive sweating, dilated pupils, micro-expressions of fear. Every checkpoint, every patrol, every random document inspection was designed to catch these tells. But when German soldiers saw a middle-aged woman struggling with a wooden leg, carrying firewood or shopping for vegetables, their brains processed not a threat before conscious thought engaged. The limp wasn't a flaw to overlook. It was a cognitive exploit that turned German training against itself. On November 27, 1943, Virginia Hall walked past Klaus Barbie himself on a Lion Street. She was dressed as a peasant, clutching a basket of turnips, her wooden leg clicking on the cobblestones. Barbie was holding a wanted poster with her description. He looked directly at her, his eyes passing over the grey hair, the rural dress, the wooden leg. He saw exactly what he expected to see. Another French nobody, irrelevant to the hunt for dangerous spies. His mind didn't even register the limp, because his training taught him that spies concealed disabilities, not weaponized them. German intelligence doctrine calculated credentials, backgrounds, training, physical capability. They calculated surveillance patterns, radio frequencies, document authentication, interrogation resistance. They calculated everything except one variable. You cannot catch what you've trained yourself not to see. And Virginia Hall had transformed herself into exactly what German soldiers were conditioned to ignore. A disabled woman who could barely walk, harmless and beneath notice. Someone who existed in the gaps of their perception. While Klaus Barbie searched for a dangerous American operative, she shuffled past his checkpoints 673 times across 1,500 resistance operations, and he never saw her once. The paradox that had already frustrated Klaus Barbie's best counterintelligence operatives was only the first of three advantages Virginia Hall possessed. German doctrine assumed that identifying an enemy agent was equivalent to capturing them. The Gestapo had distributed detailed wanted posters across every train station, checkpoint, and Vichy police headquarters in southern France. Height: 5 feet, 8 inches. Hair: auburn. Age: 36. Distinguishing feature: pronounced limp, prosthetic left leg. American accent. The description was precise, verified, and completely useless. In intelligence operations, the most effective camouflage isn't invisibility, but irrelevance. German soldiers at checkpoints were trained to scrutinize young men, watch for nervous behavior, check papers for forgeries. They expected danger to look dangerous. A disabled middle-aged woman shuffling through with a basket of vegetables triggered none of their threat recognition patterns. The wooden leg that German intelligence believed made Hall conspicuous actually rendered her psychologically invisible. On January 22, 1942, Virginia Hall approached a Wehrmacht checkpoint outside Toulouse, carrying a suitcase containing 50,000 francs in cash, forged identity documents for 3 SOE agents, and coded messages detailing German ammunition depot locations. This was Operation 114 of what would eventually become Coordination of 1,500 resistance fighters. The young corporal manning the checkpoint looked at her papers, looked at her wooden leg, asked where she was going. "To my sister's farm," she said in heavily accented French, allowing the prosthetic to click loudly on the pavement. The corporal waved her through without opening the suitcase. He later wrote in his log that he'd processed 12 civilians, no suspicious activity. The psychological mechanism was automatic. His training taught him that spies concealed weaknesses. A woman displaying obvious disability couldn't possibly be concealing anything else. She walked 300 meters past the checkpoint, delivered the cash to a resistance cell in Toulouse, and returned through the same checkpoint 90 minutes later. The same corporal was on duty. He didn't recognize her. She had put on a different headscarf. By this point in the war, Hall had passed through German checkpoints displaying her wooden leg 237 times. She was never detained. Gestapo intelligence assessments continued to describe the prosthetic as her primary identifying feature, making capture inevitable, while that same feature was protecting her better than any forged papers could. The second advantage emerged from what German counterintelligence considered Virginia Hall's fatal vulnerability. She wasn't a trained intelligence operative. The Abwehr and Sicherheitsdienst had developed protocols through decades of professional experience. Agents were taught to maintain cover stories under interrogation, use dead drops for communication, change safe houses on rigid schedules, compartmentalize information, trust no one. These protocols made sense when facing other professional intelligence services, but they assumed both sides were playing the same game. Virginia Hall wasn't playing their game. She had 6 weeks of SOE training and no intention of following doctrine. When told to change safe houses weekly, she stayed in the same Lyon apartment for 15 months because moving would draw more attention than staying. When instructed to use dead drops for communication, she met contacts face-to-face in cafes because she could read people in person better than any authentication code. When ordered to compartmentalize and limit her network, she recruited 90 agents who all knew her because trust required relationship. German intelligence expected professional tradecraft. Hall gave them something their training hadn't prepared them for: effective improvisation that looked like amateur mistakes. During July 1942, Hall coordinated the Mausack prison break that freed 12 captured SOE agents. The operation violated every security protocol SOE had taught her. She recruited Gabi Bloch, wife of one of the prisoners, who had no intelligence training whatsoever. She used the same safe houses she'd been using for months. She coordinated with Georges Béguet, who was transmitting from inside the prison, creating radio signals the Gestapo could theoretically triangulate. She arranged for escapees to meet her directly in Lyon, linking herself explicitly to the operation. Any professional intelligence officer reviewing the plan would have classified it as suicidal. Klaus Barbie had informants throughout Lyon. The Gestapo was actively hunting Hall. Standard doctrines said to minimize contact, use cutouts, maintain deniability. But Hall calculated that speed and trust would succeed where caution would fail. She was right. All 12 prisoners escaped on July 15th. By August 11th, they'd reached her in Lyon. By September, 10 of them were back in England. The Gestapo arrested no one. Barbie's after-action report noted security failure at Mausack, but identified no network and no organizer. Professional doctrine said her methods should have failed. Her network of 1,500 resistance fighters eventually proved that effectiveness mattered more than elegance. But the third advantage proved most devastating to German intelligence operations. Virginia Hall's network was built on people German counterintelligence didn't consider legitimate intelligence assets. The Abwehr recruited from military backgrounds, university-educated professionals, individuals with established credentials they could verify. Hall recruited from brothels, convents, and medical offices. Her primary Lyon contact was Germain Guérin, owner of one of the city's most prominent brothels. Guérin's employees extracted intelligence from German officers between sheets, information that German security services never imagined was being compromised. Dr. Jean Rousset, a gynecologist, had access to Vichy officials' wives and their unguarded conversations. Robert Boiteux, a Jesuit priest, hid radio equipment in confessionals where German soldiers came seeking absolution. These weren't the trained operatives German counterintelligence was looking for. They were invisible precisely because they weren't supposed to exist as intelligence threats. When the Gestapo infiltrated resistance networks, they looked for military-aged men with suspicious backgrounds. They didn't investigate middle-aged prostitutes, respected doctors, or Catholic priests. Hall had found the gaps in German surveillance and filled them with people who belonged there. On March 8, 1944, 6 weeks before D-Day, Virginia Hall needed intelligence on Wehrmacht defensive positions in Haute-Loire. Standard intelligence procedure would involve deploying trained reconnaissance operatives to observe and report. Hall asked Marie-Louise Monet, who ran a café frequented by German officers, to simply listen. Over 3 weeks, Monet served coffee to Wehrmacht engineers and remembered everything they said. She had no training in military terminology, couldn't identify units or equipment designations. She just repeated conversations verbatim to Hall, who decoded the intelligence and transmitted coordinates to London. The information guided Allied bombing raids that destroyed 3 Wehrmacht supply depots, 2 ammunition dumps, and a fuel storage facility worth 2 million Reichsmarks. The Gestapo never connected the cafe owner to the intelligence leak because their threat model didn't include civilian service workers. This was Operation 432 in Hall's network that would eventually coordinate 1,500 fighters. Her advantage wasn't training or technology. It was understanding that German intelligence was searching for threats that looked like intelligence operations, and she had built an intelligence operation that looked like ordinary French civilian life. German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality. The Gestapo operated with resources that should have been overwhelming. Klaus Barbie commanded 200 Gestapo officers in the Lyon region alone, supported by 500 Vichy police, informant networks penetrating French civilian populations, direction-finding equipment capable of locating radio transmissions within minutes, and interrogation facilities where captured resistance members could be tortured until they revealed everything. The Sicherheitsdienst intelligence assessment had calculated that this concentration of force made Lyon resistance operations impossible to sustain. Standard counterinsurgency doctrine proved that professional intelligence services always defeated amateur resistance networks. The mathematics were simple. More personnel, more resources, more training always won. The doctrine had worked in Prague, Warsaw, Amsterdam, Brussels. There was no reason it should fail in Lyon. But operational tempo proved more valuable than operational sophistication. Barbie's 200 officers had to investigate thousands of French civilians, process intelligence reports, coordinate with Wehrmacht units, manage informant networks, interrogate suspects, and plan operations. Each investigation required days of surveillance, document verification, and background checks. Each arrest required interrogation, processing, and imprisonment logistics. Professional intelligence work was thorough but slow. Virginia Hall operated with 90 core agents who made decisions in minutes, moved without coordination delays, and communicated through personal relationships rather than bureaucratic channels. When Hall learned of a German supply convoy, she could organize a resistance ambush within hours. When Barbie learned of possible resistance activity, his investigation took days before he could even confirm a target existed. The Gestapo was hunting with precision instruments. Hall was fighting with speed. In Lyon's fluid intelligence environment, speed defeated precision every time. The numbers told the story German High Command didn't want to acknowledge. From August 1941 through November 1942, during Hall's first deployment in Lyon, the Gestapo arrested 1,200 resistance members across southern France. Of those captured, only 5 had direct contact with Virginia Hall's network, and all 5 were periphery members who knew no operational details. Zero-core network members were compromised. Barbie's arrest rate across the general resistance population was 43%. Against Hall's network specifically, his success rate was functionally zero. Meanwhile, Hall's network facilitated escape of 47 Allied airmen back to England, each representing hundreds of thousands of dollars in training investment saved. She transmitted over 300 intelligence reports to London containing German troop movements, supply depot locations, and Wehrmacht defensive positions. She coordinated sabotage operations that destroyed 8 ammunition dumps, 13 supply trains, and 27 Wehrmacht vehicles. And she organized the only successful mass prison break in SOE history. The Gestapo had more personnel, better technology, and professional training. Virginia Hall had operational tempo, and networks built on trust rather than doctrine. By any measure of intelligence effectiveness, she was winning. Her second deployment with the OSS in 1944 demonstrated this advantage even more dramatically. Working in territory still occupied by Wehrmacht forces, disguised as an elderly peasant woman named Marcel Montagne, Hall coordinated the arming and training of 1,500 Maquis resistance fighters in Haute-Loire. This number represented the culmination of everything she'd learned about operational tempo versus technical sophistication. Professional military doctrine said that organizing 1,500 fighters required months of planning, formal command structures, supply chains, communication networks. Hall did it in 12 weeks, using personal relationships and improvised logistics. She scouted drop zones for Allied supply drops by walking the countryside with her wooden leg, marking coordinates that she transmitted to London through a radio hidden in an ordinary suitcase. She trained resistance leaders in guerrilla tactics using knowledge gained from 6 weeks of OSS instruction, supplemented by 15 months of field experience. She coordinated attacks on German positions by sending messages through farmers, priests, and shopkeepers who moved through the countryside without drawing Wehrmacht attention. And she did all of this while every German unit in the region had descriptions of the limping lady and orders to arrest her on sight. Wehrmacht. Logistics officers were recording a disturbing pattern they couldn't explain. Resources deployed to counter resistance activities in Haute-Loire were costing more than the resistance was actually destroying. Anti-partisan operations required pulling frontline infantry from defensive positions. Convoy security meant dedicating vehicles and personnel to guard duty instead of combat operations. Garrison troops needed to defend supply depots' reduced forces available for fighting the Allied advance. The Wehrmacht calculated that one active resistance network tied down approximately 300 soldiers in security duties. Virginia Hall's network of 1,500 fighters was tying down over 4,000 Wehrmacht and SS personnel who could have been defending against the Allied invasion. The resource mathematics were backwards. Each resistance fighter Hall coordinated cost the Allies almost nothing. Weapons were airdropped from surplus stocks. Fighters were volunteers who supplied their own food and shelter. Hall herself cost only her OSS salary. But each of those resistance fighters forced the Germans to dedicate multiple soldiers to counterinsurgency operations, pulling combat strength from where it was desperately needed. It was perfect asymmetric warfare, and it was costing the Wehrmacht strategic positioning they couldn't afford to lose. German intelligence attempted to calculate Virginia Hall's personal cost-benefit, and the numbers were disturbing. Conservative estimates suggested the Gestapo had invested over 8 million Reichsmarks, specifically trying to locate and capture her. This included dedicated surveillance teams, rewards offered to informants, coordination with Vichy police, distribution of wanted posters, direction-finding operations, targeting her radio transmissions, and the operational costs of Klaus Barbie's obsessive 15-month hunt. 8 million Reichsmarks to capture one woman. The British had invested approximately £12,000 in her training and support, equivalent to 60,000 Reichsmarks. The Americans provided her operational funding of roughly $15,000 for her OSS mission, another 60,000 Reichsmarks. Total Allied investment in Virginia Hall, 120,000 Reichsmarks. German investment trying to stop her, 8 million Reichsmarks. Cost ratio, 67 to 1 in Hall's favor. And she was still operational, still coordinating the 1,500 resistance fighters whose actions would help clear Haute-Loire of German forces before American troops even arrived. She had conducted more intelligence operations than entire Gestapo regional offices, processed in a year. She had survived longer behind enemy lines than 90% of SOE agents. And every day she remained free. She cost the Wehrmacht resources they couldn't replace and intelligence advantages they couldn't recover. German high command was beginning to realize that killing one woman with a wooden leg was costing more than that woman was costing the Allies, and Virginia Hall had absolutely no intention of stopping. As German high command grappled with the resource drain one woman was inflicting on their counterintelligence apparatus, Allied intelligence officers advancing through liberated France were about to uncover the full scale of the Gestapo's obsession. What they found in captured files would reveal not just a hunt for a single spy, but a systematic fixation that had consumed extraordinary resources while achieving nothing. September 3rd, 1944. American OSS officers entered evacuated Gestapo headquarters in Lyon, 48 hours after Klaus Barbie fled ahead of Allied forces. The building had been stripped of most intelligence materials, but in the basement archives, buried under files deemed less critical for evacuation, they found 16 folders marked Artemis, Priority Alpha. Each folder was thick, some containing over 300 pages. The Americans initially assumed Artemis was a code name for a high-value network or Soviet intelligence operation. What they found instead was comprehensive documentation of a 3-year hunt for one woman. Personnel assignment records showed that, at peak, 47 Gestapo officers were dedicated full-time to the Artemis investigation. Informant payment ledgers recorded 1.2 million francs paid to sources across southern France. Surveillance logs documented 847 separate reported sightings, each investigated, none resulting in capture. Communication intercepts filled entire folders with decoded radio transmissions the Gestapo knew came from her network but could never trace to her location. Wanted posters had been printed in 17 different versions as intelligence updated her description. The final version, dated October 1943, included a reward of 5 million francs, equivalent to what the Gestapo paid for information on entire resistance networks. And underneath all the documentation was a single American passport photo, clipped to a personnel file from the U.S. State Department in Ankara, dated 1933. Virginia Hall, age 27, showing her wooden prosthetic leg during a medical examination that had ended her diplomatic career. The Gestapo had known exactly who they were hunting. They had known for over 2 years. They had never come close. American interrogators began systematic interviews of captured Gestapo personnel in October 1944, asking specifically about high-value operations on the most wanted lists. When they mentioned Artemis or showed Hall's photo, the reactions were remarkably consistent. Most officers recognized her immediately. Several showed visible frustration. One criminal commissar, formerly assigned to Barbie's Lyon office, refused to discuss the case initially, citing professional embarrassment. The interrogation transcripts revealed something beyond typical intelligence failure. These were experienced counterintelligence professionals, men who had successfully rolled up resistance networks across occupied Europe, who had captured dozens of Allied agents, who understood tradecraft and surveillance doctrine, and they had been methodically outmaneuvered by an American woman with no formal intelligence training and a prosthetic leg that should have made her the easiest target in France. The psychological impact ran deeper than operational failure. Nazi ideology had built its worldview on hierarchies of capability: German over Slav, Aryan over Jew, man over woman. The entire system of military thought assumed that physical fitness, professional training, and masculine aggression determined combat effectiveness. Virginia Hall violated every assumption. She was a woman. She was disabled. She was an amateur in tradecraft. And she had beaten the Gestapo's best officers so thoroughly that Barbie had been transferred to different duties in early 1943. After his superiors concluded the Artemis investigation was consuming resources disproportionate to any single target's value, but Barbie hadn't failed due to incompetence or insufficient resources. He had failed because Virginia Hall understood something German intelligence doctrine couldn't accommodate. Effectiveness in asymmetric warfare came from exploiting the enemy's assumptions, not matching their capabilities. The Gestapo assumed spies looked like threats. Hall looked like she needed help crossing the street. Their entire operational model was optimized to find what she wasn't. While German intelligence pieced together their failures in Lyon's abandoned headquarters, Virginia Hall was coordinating the liberation of Haute-Loire, directing 1,500 Maquis fighters in operations that cleared the department of Wehrmacht forces before American troops arrived. This was Operation 1147 since she'd begun intelligence work in 1941. The number had become nearly incomprehensible to Allied intelligence officers reviewing her operational record. Individual SOE agents typically conducted 15 to 25 operations before rotation, death, or capture. Hall had conducted over 1,000. Each operation represented a risk of exposure, a chance of compromise, an opportunity for the Gestapo to close in. She had survived not through caution, but through understanding that the wooden leg made her invisible because German training taught soldiers to dismiss disabled women as non-threats. Every checkpoint she passed, every time a German soldier looked at her limp and waved her through, validated her tactical insight. The Gestapo had distributed her description to every checkpoint in southern France. Thousands of German soldiers had seen that description. Hundreds had probably looked directly at her. None recognized her because they couldn't reconcile most dangerous Allied spy with limping peasant grandmother. The cognitive dissonance was too great. Their minds simply categorized her as irrelevant and moved on. After the war ended, Allied interrogation teams systematically interviewed captured German intelligence personnel about operations against Allied networks in France. The testimonies regarding Virginia Hall revealed consistent patterns: humiliation, frustration, and grudging respect that most tried to minimize in official statements but couldn't completely suppress. Sturmbannführer Werner Hoffmann, formerly Barbie's deputy in Lyon, testified at his 1947 war crimes trial. When prosecutors asked about the Artemis investigation, Hoffmann's response entered the official record. We knew her name by late 1941. We had her physical description, including the prosthetic leg. We had informants throughout Lyon. We had surveillance on suspected resistance safe houses. We intercepted her radio transmissions, though we could never locate her before she moved. I personally reviewed 43 separate reports from checkpoints claiming possible sightings. We investigated every report. She was never where the reports said she'd been. It was not that we underestimated her because she was a woman. We understood she was dangerous. The problem was that every tactical advantage we possessed, superior numbers, professional training, informant networks, detection equipment, meant nothing when the target could simply walk through our checkpoints, displaying the very characteristic we were searching for. The limp that should have identified her became her perfect camouflage, because our soldiers saw disabled women as civilians requiring assistance, not threats requiring investigation. By the time we understood this tactical deception, she had escaped to Spain. When she returned in 1944, we knew she was back. We never found her. She helped arm over 1,000 resistance fighters who killed German soldiers and destroyed German equipment. The resources we expended hunting one woman exceeded what we spent on entire resistance networks. The Reichssicherheitshauptamt calculated we spent 8 million Reichsmarks on the investigation. When I learned this figure after the war, I understood why several officers, including myself, were disciplined. That money represented 50 panzer tanks, or 200 MG-42 machine guns, or ammunition for an entire division. We spent it hunting a ghost who was actually a limping woman. Obersturmführer Karl Bader, assigned to Lion Gestapo radio detection section, provided testimony during denazification proceedings in 1946 about hunting Hall's transmissions. Her radio operations violated every security protocol we expected. She should have transmitted from secure locations that she changed constantly. Instead, she transmitted from locations throughout Lion, sometimes the same locations multiple times. This should have made triangulation simple, but she never transmitted long enough for us to get accurate fixes. 3 to 5 minutes maximum. Then silence. By the time our direction-finding trucks arrived at the approximate area, she was gone. We recorded 37 separate transmissions we attributed to her network. We never successfully located her. I was considered expert in radio detection. I had successfully located and shut down 6 other clandestine transmitters in Lyon. But her operational tempo defeated our technology. She would move faster than our trucks could drive through city traffic. When we learned after the war that she was physically disabled, I initially refused to believe it. A woman with a wooden leg should not have been able to evade mobile detection units, but the operational record was clear. She did evade us. The only explanation is that she understood our detection methodology better than we understood her operational pattern. Kriminalkommissar Hans Dietrich, interrogated by British intelligence in 1945, testified about the informant network that failed to locate Hall. We paid informants across Lyon and the surrounding region. We had sources in cafes, hotels, railway stations, markets, everywhere a stranger or suspicious person might appear. The informants were told to report any woman with a prosthetic leg, any American accent, any suspicious activity. We received reports constantly. Most were French women with various injuries or conditions causing limps. We investigated every report anyway. None was Virginia Hall. My assessment after the war was that she never appeared in locations where informants expected spies to operate. She moved through market crowds, rural villages, working-class neighborhoods where our surveillance was weakest because we focused on hotels, train stations, government offices where professional agents typically worked. She wasn't a professional agent using professional tradecraft. She was an improviser who made our professional methods irrelevant. The 1,500 resistance fighters she eventually coordinated represented our complete intelligence failure. We knew she existed. We knew what she looked like. We never caught her because we were looking for a spy, and she appeared as a disabled peasant. The pattern across testimonies was unmistakable. German intelligence had documented Virginia Hall's operations extensively. They understood she was dangerous. They committed massive resources to capturing her, and they failed completely because their entire tactical and psychological framework was optimized for threats that looked like threats. Their training, their doctrine, their operational procedures all assumed that enemy agents would attempt to appear normal and blend in. They searched for concealment. Hall didn't conceal anything. She displayed her most distinctive feature openly, allowing German soldiers' own biases to create her camouflage. The wooden leg wasn't a disability to overcome in espionage work. It was a weapon she deployed against enemy assumptions. Several testimonies referenced her specific operations without knowing they were describing her. Hauptmann Georg Richter, Wehrmacht logistics officer in Haute-Loire, testified about the mysterious supply losses in 1944. Between March and September, my command lost 17 supply trucks to ambush, 2 ammunition depots to sabotage, and 1 fuel storage facility to arson. The attacks were coordinated with precision we didn't expect from resistance forces. After liberation, American intelligence showed me that these attacks were organized by a single OSS operative, coordinating approximately 1,500 local fighters. When they told me it was a woman with a wooden leg, I thought they were mocking me. But the operational records confirmed it. The resistance in our sector wasn't decentralized cells acting independently. It was a military operation commanded by one American intelligence officer. She had better intelligence on our positions than we had on hers. She knew our convoy schedules, our depot locations, our patrol patterns. We knew nothing about her except that she existed somewhere in the countryside. The tactical asymmetry was complete. We had military superiority. She had intelligence superiority. Intelligence defeated firepower. The testimonies confirmed what Virginia Hall had proven through over 1,500 operations coordinating resistance fighters, including the network that helped liberate Haute-Loire before American forces arrived. Traditional military advantages meant nothing against an adversary who understood that perception was more powerful than capability. The Gestapo saw what they expected to see, and Virginia Hall became what they couldn't imagine hunting. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Virginia Hall's operational record stood as testament to what the Gestapo had dismissed as impossible. The filing cabinets American intelligence recovered from Lion headquarters documented an intelligence failure unprecedented in scope. Over 1,500 Maquis resistance fighters coordinated under her command had cleared Haute-Loire of German forces before American troops arrived. Her network had facilitated the escape of 47 Allied pilots back to England, each representing hundreds of thousands of dollars in training investments saved. She had transmitted over 300 intelligence reports to London containing German troop movements, supply depot locations, and Wehrmacht defensive positions that directly informed Allied invasion planning. She had coordinated sabotage operations destroying 8 ammunition dumps, 13 supply trains, 27 Wehrmacht vehicles, and countless smaller installations. And she had accomplished all of this while every German checkpoint in southern France held descriptions of her wooden leg and orders to arrest on sight. The Gestapo never came close to catching her. To understand the magnitude of these achievements, comparison to other intelligence operatives provides context. Most SOE agents operated for 4 to 6 months before capture, death, or extraction. Hall operated for 15 months in her first deployment with SOE, then returned for 7 more months with OSS after the Gestapo had already identified her and distributed wanted posters with her description. The average SOE agent successfully coordinated perhaps 2 or 3 significant operations before compromise. Hall organized the largest prison break in SOE history, escaped over the Pyrenees with a wooden leg, and then organized a resistance army of 1,500 fighters. British intelligence calculated that successful field agents might recruit 10 to 20 reliable contacts over their careers. Hall recruited 90 core network members, plus hundreds of peripheral assets, including prostitutes, priests, doctors, and police officers that German counterintelligence never identified. And she did this while physically disabled in ways that German doctrine insisted disqualified her from field operations entirely. Contemporary OSS assessments noted that Hall's operational tempo and effectiveness exceeded that of entire intelligence stations. One internal memo from 1945 calculated that her intelligence reports alone had strategic value worth approximately $12 million, while the British and American investment in her training and support totaled less than $200,000. Return on investment, 60 to 1. The human cost of sustained intelligence operations rarely appears in official statistics, but Hall's physical condition after the war documented the toll. Years of constant movement with a wooden prosthetic had caused permanent damage to her stump, requiring multiple surgeries in the decade after the war. The psychological stress of operating under constant threat of capture and torture, knowing that the Gestapo was specifically hunting her, left effects she never discussed publicly, but that family members later acknowledged. She had lived 3 years watching comrades arrested, tortured, executed. She had organized operations knowing each decision might send someone to their death. She had walked past German soldiers hundreds of times, knowing that recognition meant immediate arrest, interrogation, and almost certain execution as a spy. The 1,500 resistance fighters she coordinated represented not just a military achievement, but a moral burden. Each fighter she armed faced lethal risk because she had recruited them. That she sustained this for 3 years, while the Gestapo expended 8 million Reichsmarks, specifically hunting her, demonstrated psychological resilience as remarkable as her tactical skills. But Hall's individual record tells only part of the story. The broader intelligence war validated something German counterintelligence doctrine hadn't anticipated: that amateur improvisation could defeat professional methodology when the amateur understood the operational environment better than the professionals. German intelligence in France arrested thousands of resistance members through systematic application of proven techniques. They successfully rolled up networks in Paris, Marseille, Bordeaux, and dozens of smaller operations. Their success rate against typical resistance networks exceeded 40%. Against Virginia Hall's network specifically, their success rate was functionally zero. This wasn't luck or coincidence. It was deliberate exploitation of German assumptions. The Gestapo expected spies to hide. Hall displayed her most distinctive feature openly. They expected agents to follow security protocols. She broke protocols whenever effectiveness demanded it. They expected intelligence networks to look like intelligence networks. She built hers to look like ordinary French civilian life. The cost-effectiveness was devastating. Germans spent 67 Reichsmarks for every one the Allies spent on Hall, and achieved zero return on that investment. This ratio, 67-1 against German favor, represented the perfect asymmetric warfare outcome. The strategic impact extended beyond measurable statistics. Hall's network tied down over 4,000 Wehrmacht and SS personnel in security operations, pulling combat troops from defensive positions they desperately needed for fighting the Allied advance. Her intelligence on German coastal defenses fed into Overlord, planning for Normandy invasion. Her coordination of Maquis sabotage operations disrupted German supply lines during the critical weeks after D-Day, when Wehrmacht was trying to reinforce Normandy defenses. Allied intelligence calculated that resistance operations Hall coordinated in Haute-Loire delayed German reinforcement by approximately 72 hours, 3 days that allowed Allied forces to establish beachhead positions that might otherwise have been overrun. The propaganda value was equally significant. Proof that a disabled American woman could operate for 3 years inside occupied France, while the Gestapo hunted her, specifically undermined German claims of Aryan superiority and boosted Allied morale. General William Donovan, head of OSS, later wrote in classified assessments that Hall's operations represented strategic impact disproportionate to resources invested, validating unconventional warfare methodology against conventional military doctrine. She proved that in intelligence warfare, technological sophistication and numerical superiority mattered less than tactical innovation and understanding enemy psychology. After the war ended, Virginia Hall faced challenges that medals couldn't address. She had spent 3 years in constant danger, where every interaction could mean death, where trust was calculated risk, where success meant people lived and failure meant they died. Returning to peacetime America required psychological adjustment few understood. The CIA, successor to OSS, hired her in 1951, and she worked for Special Activities Division until mandatory retirement in 1966 at age 60. But the work was largely desk-bound, analyzing intelligence rather than gathering it. The woman who had coordinated 1,500 fighters and outsmarted the Gestapo for 3 years spent her final career writing reports. She rarely spoke about her wartime experiences, even with family. When President Truman attempted to present her Distinguished Service Cross publicly, she insisted on a private ceremony, not wanting attention or fame. She had been awarded the British MBE, the French Croix de Guerre, and become the only civilian woman to receive the Distinguished Service Cross during World War II. She stored the medals in a drawer and never displayed them. Former OSS colleagues who visited her suburban Maryland home in the 1960s found nothing indicating her past. No photos of France, no memorabilia from operations, no acknowledgement of the woman the Gestapo had called the most dangerous Allied spy. She died in 1982, age 76, having spent the last decades gardening and living quietly. Her obituaries were brief, mentioning her intelligence work in general terms, but not the specifics that remained classified. For decades, Virginia Hall remained virtually unknown outside intelligence circles. Cold War secrecy kept most OSS operations classified. The few accounts that emerged focused on male agents or the more dramatic stories of captured operatives who faced execution. Hall's story, a woman with a wooden leg who simply never got caught, lacked the tragic martyrdom that post-war narratives preferred. Soviet intelligence had similar difficulty acknowledging effective female operatives because their achievements challenged patriarchal assumptions about combat capability. German testimonies about Hall existed in scattered war crimes, trials and denazification hearings, but weren't compiled systematically. The 1980s brought gradual declassification. The 1990s saw historians accessing German and Allied archives and piecing together what the Gestapo had tried so desperately to destroy, comprehensive documentation of Hall's operations. Books published in the 2000s finally told her story to wider audiences. The CIA dedicated permanent exhibit space to her in 2016, including the painting Les Marguerites fleuriront ce soir, showing her in peasant disguise. In 2020, the American Special Operations Command announced plans for naming a ship after her. Modern recognition came too late for Hall herself to witness, but validates what Klaus Barbie learned too late in his obsessive hunt. You cannot capture what you've trained yourself not to see. The story of Virginia Hall transcends its historical moment and reveals principles about warfare, intelligence, and human nature that remain relevant. About asymmetric conflict, that tactical innovation defeats superior resources when the innovator understands the operational environment better than the enemy. The Gestapo had more officers, better technology, professional training, and 8 million Reichsmarks. Hall had a wooden leg, 6 weeks of instruction, and willingness to improvise. She won because she understood that German soldiers would dismiss disabled women automatically, and she weaponized that dismissal about prejudice and assumptions, that underestimating any enemy based on preconceptions creates exploitable vulnerabilities. German doctrine about women, disability, and proper intelligence tradecraft was precisely correct for the threats it was designed to counter. It was completely wrong for threats it couldn't imagine existed. Hall exploited that blind spot for 3 years. About determination, that sustained operations under constant mortal threat requires psychological resilience beyond what medals can measure. 1,500 Maquis fighters coordinated, 47 pilots saved, 300 intelligence reports transmitted, dozens of sabotage operations organized, each representing a moment when capture meant torture and death. Yet she continued. About effective deception, that the best camouflage isn't invisibility but irrelevance. German soldiers saw Hall's wooden leg hundreds of times at checkpoints. They saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a disabled woman who needed help, not a threat requiring investigation. Their training taught them spies concealed weaknesses. She displayed hers openly and became invisible. About organizational psychology, that bureaucratic procedures optimized for professional threats fail against threats that don't resemble the expected pattern. The Gestapo's systematic methodology worked brilliantly against conventional resistance networks. It was useless against Hall's network built from prostitutes, priests, and cafe owners because counterintelligence doctrine didn't classify such people as intelligence threats. About cost-benefit analysis, that warfare effectiveness isn't measured by sophistication, but by ratio of investment to impact. Hall cost the Allies minimal resources and cost the Germans 8 million Reichsmarks plus 4,000 soldiers diverted to security operations, all while achieving zero success against her network. The German officer who dismissed women in occupied France never understood what Virginia Hall proved through 3 years of operations the Gestapo couldn't stop. That courage doesn't require perfect credentials. That skill can overcome institutional advantages, and that determination combined with tactical understanding makes organizational superiority irrelevant. Her coordination of 1,500 resistance fighters wasn't just a military achievement. It was proof that the Germans calculated resources, technology, training, and doctrine, but never calculated the one variable that mattered most: an adversary who understood their assumptions better than they did. And in occupied France, where she should have been the easiest target, walking past checkpoints displaying the wooden leg that wanted posters described, Virginia Hall proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the most powerful one. It's the one your enemy sees clearly but dismisses as harmless. The Gestapo spent 3 years hunting a spy. They never caught the limping peasant woman who was always right in front of them,